On the morning of October 15th, 1857, the gallows at Augusta County Jail cast its shadow across a crowd of nearly 3,000 spectators. They had come to witness the execution of a man whose confessions had horrified even the most hardened lawmen in Mississippi. James Copeland, 34 years old, sat in his cell methodically recounting the details of murders so brutal that the court's stenographer had to pause several times to compose himself. Among the evidence presented at trial were 43 human fingers preserved in salt and stored in a leather pouch that Copeland had carried for over a decade. Each finger told a story of calculated cruelty along the Pearl River, where entire families had learned to barricade their doors at sunset. What transformed a respected young farmer into the most feared outlaw in the American South had remained a mystery until those final confessions revealed truths that authorities had tried to suppress for years. Before we continue with the story of James Copeland and the terror that gripped the Pearl River Valley, I want you to know that this channel brings you the darkest and most mysterious stories from American history. If you're fascinated by true crime and historical mysteries, subscribe now and tell me in the comments what state or city you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover these forgotten tales of terror. The path that led James Copeland to the gallows began not with violence, but with a simple act of kindness that would ultimately damn his soul forever. Pearl River County, Mississippi, in the 1840s, was a land where civilization hung by a thread. Dense cypress swamps stretched for miles along the winding Pearl River, creating a natural barrier between the settled farmlands and the wild frontier beyond. Spanish moss draped the ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, and the humid air carried the constant sound of insects and the occasional splash of an alligator disappearing beneath the dark water. The Copeland family had established their homestead in 1838 when James was barely 15 years old. His father, Samuel Copeland, had purchased 200 acres of fertile bottomland from a retiring fur trapper named Etienne Budrow. The property included a modest 2-story farmhouse, a barn, and several outbuildings that had seen better days. Samuel Copeland was known throughout the county as an honest man who paid his debts and treated his neighbors with respect. His wife Martha had died giving birth to James, leaving the boy to be raised by his father and an elderly aunt named Prudence. Young James possessed an unusual combination of intelligence and physical strength. He could read and write better than most men twice his age. Yet he could also fell a tree or break a horse with remarkable skill. Neighbors often remarked that he had his mother's gentle eyes and his father's strong hands. By 1842, when James reached 19, he had become one of the most eligible bachelors in the county. He stood 6 feet tall with dark hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through a person. The Pearl River served as both lifeline and highway for the scattered communities along its banks. Steamboats brought supplies and news from New Orleans, while smaller vessels carried cotton, timber, and other goods downstream to market. The river also attracted less savory characters, gamblers, confidence men, and outlaws who used the labyrinthine swamps as hideouts between their crimes. Sheriff Thomas Bullock, a veteran of the Creek Wars, did his best to maintain order, but his jurisdiction covered over 800 square miles of some of the most challenging terrain in Mississippi. In 1843, James Copeland met Elizabeth Hartwell at a harvest festival in Columbia, the county seat. Elizabeth was the daughter of Judge William Hartwell, one of the most respected men in southern Mississippi. She possessed a rare beauty with auburn hair and green eyes that reflected intelligence and kindness. More importantly, she seemed genuinely interested in James despite the difference in their social standing. Judge Hartwell owned a plantation with over 50 slaves and had connections throughout the state government. Their courtship proceeded according to the customs of the time. James would ride the 15 miles to Columbia every Sunday after church, bringing small gifts and spending carefully chaperoned hours with Elizabeth on the Hartwell plantation. The judge initially harbored reservations about his daughter courting a simple farmer, but James' intelligence and obvious devotion to Elizabeth gradually won him over. By the spring of 1844, everyone expected an engagement announcement. The first sign of trouble came in April of that year when a merchant named Calvin Richardson disappeared while traveling from Hattiesburg to Columbia. Richardson had been carrying nearly $800 in gold coins to purchase land near the Hartwell plantation. His horse was found wandering near the Pearl River, but no trace of Richardson himself was ever discovered. Sheriff Billock organized search parties that combed the swamps for days without success. The incident cast a pall over the entire community, reminding everyone of how dangerous the frontier could be. James Copeland seemed particularly affected by Richardson's disappearance. He joined every search party and spent long hours walking the riverbanks, looking for any sign of the missing merchant. Elizabeth later told investigators that James had become increasingly moody and distracted during this period. He would often stare off into the distance during their conversations, as if his mind was elsewhere entirely. The truth about Calvin Richardson's fate emerged only during James Copeland's final confessions 13 years later. But the events that transpired on that April morning in 1044 would forever change the young farmer's destiny. According to Copeland's own words, spoken in a voice barely above a whisper as he sat chained in his death cell, the encounter began as a simple case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Copeland had been checking his fish traps along a remote stretch of the Pearl River about 5 miles downstream from his father's property. The morning mist still clung to the water when he heard the sound of a horse approaching through the cypress trees. Calvin Richardson emerged from the fog, riding a fine chestnut mare and leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. The merchant appeared nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if he feared pursuit. "Good morning, young man," Richardson called out, his voice betraying relief at finding another human being in the wilderness. "I seem to have lost my way. Can you direct me to the Columbia Road?" James pointed upstream toward a barely visible trail that wound through the swamp. "Follow the river for about 2 m, then look for the blazed oak tree on your left. The trail will take you straight to Columbia." Richardson then thanked him and was about to continue when his horse stumbled, throwing him to the ground with a sickening crack. The merchant's right leg bent at him. Unnatural angle clearly broken, his agonized screams echoed through the swamp, sending birds fleeing from their roosts in the ancient cypress trees. James rushed to help, his natural instincts overriding any other considerations. As he knelt beside the injured man, Richardson grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Please," the merchant gasped, "don't leave me here. There are men following me, bad men who want to rob me. They've been tracking me since Hattiesburg." The young farmer found himself faced with a terrible dilemma. Richardson's leg required immediate medical attention, but the nearest doctor was in Columbia, hours away through treacherous swamp trails. Leaving the man alone would almost certainly mean his death, either from blood loss or from the mysterious pursuers he claimed were following him. Yet carrying him to safety would be nearly impossible through the dense undergrowth. As if summoned by Richardson's fears, the sound of multiple horses crashing through the underbrush reached their ears. James helped the merchant to his feet, supporting most of his weight as they stumbled toward a thicket of palmetto bushes that offered concealment. Through the green fronds they watched 3 rough-looking men emerge from the mist, their eyes scanning the riverbank with predatory intensity. The leader was a massive man with a gray beard and arms like tree trunks. His companions appeared younger, but equally dangerous with the lean, hungry look of professional killers. They dismounted and began examining the ground where Richardson's horse had left tracks in the soft earth. "Trail goes cold here," one of them said in a voice like gravel. "Horse went into the water most likely." The bearded man shook his head. "Richardson's too smart for that. He's hiding somewhere close by." He raised his voice, addressing the swamp itself. "Come out, merchant. We know you're here. Make this easy on yourself, and we'll kill you quick." James felt Richardson's body trembling against his own as the 3 outlaws spread out along the riverbank. Merchant's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and blood was seeping through his torn trousers from the broken bone. In his delirium, he began to mumble prayers, his voice barely audible, but still too loud for their precarious situation. One of the younger outlaws froze, tilting his head like a hunting dog catching a scent. You hear that, Gideon? Sounds like someone praying. The bearded leader, apparently named Gideon, drew a long knife from his belt. The blade gleamed wickedly in the filtered sunlight. Richardson, last chance to show yourself. Come out now and we'll make it quick. Make us hunt you down and we'll take our time with you. James Copeland faced a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could remain hidden and watch these men torture and murder an innocent person, or he could reveal himself and almost certainly share Richardson's fate. The merchants' prayers grew louder as his pain intensified, and James knew their hiding place would be discovered within minutes. What happened next, according to Copeland's confession, occurred in a blur of violence that seemed to last forever yet was over in seconds. As Gideon and his men closed in on their hiding place, James made his decision. But instead of revealing himself to save Richardson, he pressed his hand firmly over the merchant's mouth, cutting off both prayers and breath. Richardson's eyes widened in terror as he realized what was happening, but his broken leg prevented any effect. Resistance. James held his hand in place until Richardson's struggle ceased, his own heart hammering so loudly he was certain the outlaws would hear it. The merchant's body went limp, and James gently lowered him to the ground behind the palmetto bushes. He had chosen his own survival over the life of an innocent man, a choice that would echo through every subsequent crime he committed. The outlaws searched for another hour before giving up their hunt. As their horses' hoofbeats faded into the distance, James Copeland found himself alone with Calvin Richardson's corpse and a terrible realization of what he had become. The merchant's lifeless eyes stared accusingly at the cypress canopy above, and his mouth remained open in a silent scream of betrayal. But James's ordeal was far from over. As he knelt beside the body, trying to comprehend what he had done, his eyes fell upon the leather saddlebags that had fallen from Richardson's horse during the accident. One of them had burst open, spilling gold coins across the moss-covered ground. James counted nearly $800, more money than his family would see in 5 years of farming. The sight of that gold triggered something dark in James' mind. Richardson was already dead, killed by his own hand to ensure their mutual silence. The merchant had no family in Mississippi, no one who would come looking for him. The 3 outlaws believed he had escaped, and the local authorities would assume he had been murdered by bandits or killed by wild animals in the swamp. If James simply disposed of the body and kept the gold, no one would ever know what had really happened. Yet, even as these thoughts formed, James realized he faced a practical problem. Richardson's body would eventually be discovered, and the broken leg would tell a story that didn't match death by drowning or animal attack. Moreover, the merchant wore a distinctive gold ring that bore his initials, and his clothes were of fine quality that would be easily recognized. Any investigation would eventually trace back to the last person seen in this area, which was James himself. It was then that James Copeland committed his first act of deliberate mutilation. Using Richardson's own knife, he carefully removed the merchant's ring finger, ensuring that the distinctive jewelry could never be traced back to its owner. The act filled him with revulsion. Yet he found the process strangely methodical, almost soothing in its precision. He wrapped the severed finger in a piece of cloth torn from Richardson's shirt and placed it in his pocket, though he could not have explained why he chose to keep it. The rest of Richardson's body went into the river, weighted down with stones, and pushed into a deep pool where alligators would dispose of any remaining evidence. James kept the gold, the knife, and that first severed finger. He told himself it was purely practical, a way to ensure his secret remained buried forever. But deep in his heart, he knew something fundamental had changed within him. The transformation was not immediate. For several weeks after Richardson's death, James continued his normal routine of farming and courting Elizabeth Hartwell. He used small amounts of the gold to make improvements to his father's property, claiming he had sold some cattle to a trader passing through. Samuel Copeland was pleased to see his son taking such initiative, never suspecting that the money had been purchased with blood. Elizabeth noticed changes in James's behavior, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced as the months passed. He became more possessive of her time and attention, less willing to tolerate the company of other suitors who might call upon her. His eyes, which had once sparkled with warmth and humor, now held a coldness that made her uncomfortable. When she mentioned these concerns to her father, Judge Hartwell dismissed them as the natural jealousy of a young man in love. The second murder occurred in September of 1844, just 5 months after Richardson's death. This time, the victim was a traveling preacher named Reverend Augustus Fleming, who had been conducting revival meetings throughout Pearl River County. Fleming was known for carrying substantial donations from his congregations, money intended for a new church in Mobile, Alabama. According to Copeland's confession, he had not planned to kill Reverend Fleming. The preacher's death resulted from what James described as an opportunity that presented itself. Fleming had stopped at the Copeland farm to water his horse and share a meal with the family. Samuel Copeland was honored to host a man of God, and the evening passed pleasantly with readings from Scripture and discussions of spiritual matters. As Fleming prepared to depart the next morning, he made a fatal mistake. He mentioned to James that he was carrying over $400 in donations and asked for directions to the safest route toward Mobile. The preacher's trusting nature and obvious wealth triggered the same dark impulses that had led to Richardson's death. James volunteered to guide Fleming through the swamp to the main Mobile road, claiming knowledge of shortcuts that would save the preacher several hours of travel time. Samuel Copeland blessed their journey and watched them disappear into the morning mist, never suspecting that he would never see Reverend Fleming alive again. The killing took place at a remote crossing where an old logging road met the river. James struck the preacher from behind with a heavy tree branch, then finished him with Richardson's knife while Fleming lay unconscious on the ground. This time the act felt easier, more natural. The revulsion he had experienced with Richardson was replaced by a cold efficiency that disturbed him even as he embraced it. Before disposing of Fleming's body, James removed the preacher's right index finger, adding it to the cloth bundle he had been carrying since Richardson's death. He told himself it was still about preventing identification, but the truth was more complex. The fingers had become trophies, physical reminders of his power over life and death. News of Reverend Fleming's disappearance spread throughout southern Mississippi like wildfire. Unlike Calvin Richardson, who had few connections in the area, the preacher was widely known and beloved. Churches across 3 counties organized search parties, and even the state government offered a reward for information about his fate. Sheriff Thomas Billock found himself under intense pressure to solve the case, particularly from religious leaders who demanded justice for their fallen brother. James Copeland joined the searches with apparent enthusiasm, volunteering countless hours to comb the swamps and back roads for any trace of the missing preacher. His dedication impressed everyone, including Elizabeth Hartwell, who praised his selflessness in helping find a man of God. Samuel Copeland beamed with pride at his son's community spirit, never imagining that James knew exactly where Reverend Fleming's remains were feeding the catfish in a deep pool of the Pearl River. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Billock discovered that both Richardson and Fleming had been carrying substantial amounts of money at the time of their disappearances. The sheriff began to suspect that a gang of robbers was operating in the area, targeting wealthy travelers who used the river roads. He sent word to authorities in surrounding counties, warning them to be alert for similar crimes. This development worried James more than he cared to admit. 2 disappearances might be coincidence, but a pattern would inevitably draw unwanted attention to anyone who had been in the area during both incidents. He needed to be more careful to space out his activities and choose victims who were less likely to be missed. The third murder occurred in December of 1844. And this time, James had learned from his previous experiences. His victim was a slave trader named Marcus Kellerman, a man whose profession made him widely despised throughout the region. Kellerman was traveling north from New Orleans with a coff of 15 enslaved people. He planned to sell in Natchez. He had stopped near the Copeland farm to make repairs to a broken wagon wheel. Samuel Copeland was uncomfortable with Kellerman's presence, but frontier hospitality demanded that he offer shelter for the night. The slave trader was a crude, violent man who treated his human cargo with casual cruelty. He boasted drunkenly about the profits he would make in Natchez and displayed a money belt containing over $600 in gold and silver. James watched Kellerman's behavior with growing disgust, but his moral outrage was mixed with the familiar hunger for the man's wealth. When Kellerman announced his intention to depart before dawn to avoid the heat of the day, James volunteered to show him a shortcut through swamp that would save several miles of difficult travel. The killing of Marcus Kellerman was the most brutal yet. James had grown more confident in his abilities, and he took his time with the slave trader, making him suffer for his cruelties before finally ending his life. He removed Kellerman's right middle finger and added it to his growing collection. But this time he also took the man's gold teeth, which he pried from the corpse's mouth with pliers. The 15 enslaved people who had witnessed Kellerman's departure with James presented a serious problem. They had seen the young farmer guide their master into the swamp, and their testimony could eventually lead investigators back to the Copeland farm. James solved this problem with characteristic ruthlessness, leading the confused and frightened people deeper into the swamp, and then abandoning them without food, water, or knowledge of the local geography. Most of the abandoned slaves died within days, victims of exposure, wild animals, and the treacherous terrain of the Mississippi swamplands. 3 managed to reach safety, but they were quickly recaptured by slave catchers and sold to new masters in distant states. Their stories of Kellerman's disappearance were dismissed as attempts to avoid punishment for running away. By 1845, James Copeland had killed 6 people and accumulated nearly $3,000 in stolen money. His collection of severed fingers had grown to include trophies from each victim, carefully preserved in salt and stored in a leather pouch he kept hidden beneath the floorboards of his room. The methodical nature of the mutilations had evolved from practical necessity into ritualistic obsession. The murders had also attracted the attention of Gideon McCready, the bearded outlaw leader, whose pursuit of Calvin Richardson had indirectly led to James's first killing. McCready was the head of a loosely organized gang of thieves and murderers who operated throughout the river parishes of Louisiana and Mississippi. He had been watching reports of the disappearances with professional interest, recognizing the work of someone who might be useful to his organization. McCready made contact with James through a series of carefully arranged meetings, each one designed to test the young farmer's reliability and ruthlessness. The outlaw leader was impressed by James' intelligence and his ability to deflect suspicion from himself, but he was particularly intrigued by the rumors of mutilation that had begun to circulate among the criminal underworld. The partnership that developed between Copeland and McCready's gang would terrorize the Pearl River Valley for the next 2 years. James provided local knowledge and legitimate cover for the gang's activities, while McCready offered protection and access to more lucrative targets. The severed fingers became James's signature, a calling card that struck fear into the hearts of potential victims and marked him as a killer worthy of respect among his criminal peers. Elizabeth Hartwell began to notice more troubling changes in her fiancé's behavior during this period. James had formally proposed marriage in the spring of 1845, and Judge Hartwell had given his blessing to the union. The wedding was planned for the following October, but Elizabeth found herself growing increasingly uncomfortable with the man she had agreed to marry. James' eyes had developed a predatory quality that reminded her of the way cats watched mice before pouncing. He spoke less frequently, but with greater intensity, and his conversations often turned to topics of violence and death that seemed inappropriate for a respectable farmer. Most disturbing of all, he had begun collecting knives and other weapons, claiming they were tools needed for farm work, but displaying them with an enthusiasm that seemed excessive. The turning point came in August of 1845, when James and McCready's gang attacked a river boat called the Southern Belle as it made its way upstream toward Columbia. The boat was carrying 12 passengers, including 2 families with young children and a cargo hold filled with valuable goods bound for merchants in. Interior, the attack was meticulously planned and executed with military precision. James had scouted the boat's schedule and identified the best location for an ambush, a narrow bend in the river where the current forced the vessel close to shore. McCready's men boarded the boat from both sides, overwhelming the small crew before they could mount any effective resistance. What followed was a massacre that shocked even hardened criminals. The gang systematically robbed and murdered every person aboard the Southern Belle, showing no mercy for age or gender. James personally killed 3 of the passengers, including a young mother who had been traveling to Columbia to attend her sister's wedding. He removed the woman's ring finger as a trophy along with her gold wedding band and pearl necklace. The Southern Belle incident marked a turning point in the gang's activities and in James Copeland's psychological development. The mass murder generated enormous public outrage and brought federal authorities into the investigation. More importantly, it satisfied something deep and dark within James' soul, confirming his transformation from reluctant killer to enthusiastic predator. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of James Copeland's depravity, the horror in Pearl River County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of one man's descent into madness. The discovery of the burned wreckage of the Southern Belle 3 days later sent shock waves throughout Mississippi. Federal marshals arrived from New Orleans to coordinate the investigation, and the state legislature authorized a special fund for rewards leading to the capture of those responsible. Sheriff Billock found himself working alongside investigators who possessed resources and expertise far beyond anything available in rural Pearl River County. The increased scrutiny forced James to be more careful in his personal life. He maintained his facade as a devoted fiancé and beautiful son, but the pressure of living a double life was taking its toll. Elizabeth noticed that he had begun talking in his sleep, muttering words she couldn't understand, and sometimes crying out if in pain. When she asked him about these nighttime disturbances, he dismissed them as the result of worry about their upcoming wedding. Samuel Copeland also observed changes in his son's behavior, though he attributed them to the natural stress of a young man preparing for marriage and increased responsibility. James had become more withdrawn and irritable, spending long hours away from the farm on what he claimed were business trips to arrange financing for new equipment. The elder Copeland was pleased that his son was showing such initiative, never suspecting that these absences coincided with additional murders throughout the region. The confession that would ultimately send James Copeland to the gallows began on October 10, 1857 in the death cell of Augusta County Jail. Sheriff William Henderson had been questioning Copeland for weeks, employing every interrogation technique he had learned during 23 years in law enforcement. The outlaw had remained stubbornly silent about the details of his crimes, responding to questions with nothing more than cold stars and occasional grunts of acknowledgement. Henderson had tried everything: appeals to conscience, promises of leniency for cooperation, even threats of additional charges. James Copeland sat on his narrow cot like a statue carved from granite, his piercing blue eyes revealing nothing of the horrors locked away in his memory. The sheriff had begun to despair of ever learning the full truth about the Pearl River murders when fate provided an unexpected key to the killer's silence. The breakthrough came when Henderson mentioned that Elizabeth Hartwell, now Elizabeth Camden, after her marriage to a respected lawyer in Columbia, had agreed to testify about James's strange behavior in the months leading up to their broken engagement. The sheriff had intended this as merely another piece of evidence to present at trial, but he noticed an immediate change in the prisoner's demeanor when her name was spoken. The mention of Elizabeth's name seemed to crack something fundamental inside James Copeland. His rigid posture slumped, and his hands, which had remained steady through weeks of interrogation, began to tremble uncontrollably. For the first time since his capture, tears began to flow down his weathered cheeks, leaving glistening tracks through the accumulated grime of captivity. "Elizabeth," he whispered, the name emerging from his lips like a prayer spoken in a forgotten language. "Sweet, beautiful Elizabeth, does she know what I became?" Sheriff Henderson recognized the moment for what it was and carefully modulated his voice to match James's subdued tone. "She knows you were arrested, James. She knows about the charges, but she doesn't know the details, not yet. She could still remember you as the young farmer she once loved. You help us understand what happened to that man." James's voice, when he finally began to speak in earnest, was barely audible, forcing Henderson to lean close to the cell bars to hear the words that would reveal the true scope of the Pearl River murders. The sheriff had prepared for this moment by bringing extra paper and ink, but nothing could have prepared him for the magnitude of the confessions that would pour forth over the next 3 days. "I loved her," James whispered, his hands gripping the iron bars with such force that his knuckles turned white. "Everything I did, every choice I made in those early days was to become worthy of her love. I wanted to be more than just a simple farmer scratching out a living from Mississippi mud. I wanted to give her the life she deserved, the life her father's wealth could provide, but that my honest labor never could. The confession that followed lasted for 3 days and filled nearly 200 pages of Henderson's careful handwriting. James Copeland described 47 separate murders committed between 1844 and 1856. Each one recounted with disturbing precision and attention to detail that spoke to both his intelligence and his complete moral corruption. He began with Calvin Richardson describing not just the killing itself, but the internal struggle that had preceded it. I held my hand over his mouth and felt his life ebb away beneath my palm, James said, his voice taking on a dreamy quality as he relived the moment. In that instant, I understood something about myself that I had never known before. I had the power to choose who lived and who died, and that power was intoxicating beyond any drug or drink. James explained a system of taking fingers as trophies, describing how the practice had evolved from practical necessity into elaborate ritual. Initially, he had removed fingers to prevent identification of the bodies, but the severed digits had gradually become symbols of his dominance over his victims. He categorized them by the circumstances of each death, developing an increasingly complex taxonomy of murder that reflected his systematic approach to killing. Each finger told a story, he explained to the horrified sheriff. This one belonged to a merchant who begged for his life until the very end. This one came from a preacher who cursed me with his dying breath. This one was taken from a woman who fought like a wildcat to protect her children before I silenced her forever. The most shocking revelation came when James led Sheriff Henderson and a team of federal marshals to a hidden cave along the Pearl River, where he had stored his macabre recollection. The cave was located on a small island, accessible only during low water, surrounded by cypress trees draped in Spanish moss that created a natural cathedral of shadows and silence. Inside the cave, investigators found not only the leather case containing 43 preserved human fingers, but also a treasure trove of evidence that painted a complete picture of James Copeland's criminal career. He had kept detailed written records of each killing, including sketches of his victims, maps showing the locations of their deaths, and careful notes about their final words, and the amounts of money or valuables taken from their bodies. The cave also contained personal items from each victim, jewelry, watches, religious medals, family photographs, and other mementos that James had collected as secondary trophies. Most disturbing of all was a series of journals in which he had recorded his thoughts and feelings about each murder, describing his emotional state during the killings and analyzing his techniques for future improvement. I studied my craft like other men study medicine or law, James told Henderson as they examined the cave's contents. I read every account of famous murders I could find, looking for techniques I could adapt or improve upon. I experimented with different methods of killing, timing my victims' death to maximize their suffering while minimizing the risk of discovery. One journal contained detailed observations about the psychology of his victims, noting how different types of people reacted to the realization that they were about to die. James had categorized these reactions and developed specific approaches for dealing with each type, treating murder as a science that could be perfected through careful study and practice. Federal Marshal Robert Thornberry, who had been assigned to coordinate the multi-state investigation, described the cave as a monument to evil that exceeded anything in my 30 years of law enforcement. The methodical nature of James's record-keeping provided investigators with a roadmap to dozens of unsolved murders throughout the Mississippi River Valley, cases that had baffled local authorities for years. But the true horror of James Copeland's crimes went beyond mere numbers or even the grotesque trophy collection. His confession revealed a systematic campaign of terror that had traumatized an entire region for over a decade. Families had lived in constant fear. Travelers had avoided the Pearl River roads, and entire communities had been transformed by the knowledge that a monster walked among them. The psychological profile that emerged from James's confession painted a picture of a man who had gradually surrendered his humanity in pursuit of wealth and power, but who had retained enough intelligence and social awareness to maintain his facade as a respectable citizen. He described the evolution of his killing methods with the detached precision of a craftsman discussing his trade, showing no remorse for his actions, but rather a kind of professional pride in his efficiency and success. "I became what I needed to become," he told Henderson during one particularly intense session. "Society creates its monsters by offering rewards that honest men cannot achieve through honest means. I simply had the courage to take what I wanted rather than accepting the limitations that others imposed upon themselves." Elizabeth Hartwell Camden's testimony, delivered behind closed doors to spare her the ordeal of a public appearance, provided crucial insight into James' deteriorating mental state during the period of his most intensive criminal activity. She described subtle changes in his behavior that had begun even before their engagement, changes that she had attributed to the normal stresses of courtship and preparation for marriage. He began speaking differently about other people. She told the court through tears that she struggled to control. Where once he had shown compassion for the unfortunate, he began expressing contempt for those he considered weak or foolish. He spoke about the poor as if they deserved their fate, and about the wealthy as if their success proved their superiority to other men. Elizabeth also described nightmares that had plagued her for years after breaking their engagement. Dreams in which James appeared as a creature of shadows and blood, who whispered her name with voices of the dead. These dreams had been so vivid and disturbing that she had consulted with ministers and even a specialist in nervous disorders, but nothing had provided relief from the recurring visions. Most damning of all was her recollection of a conversation they had shared during the summer of 1845, just months before she ended their engagement. James had been describing his plans for their future together, speaking of the wealth he would accumulate and the status they would achieve in Mississippi society. When Elizabeth had asked how he planned to accomplish these goals so quickly, he had smiled in a way that made her blood run cold. "He told me that there were opportunities all around us for those bold enough to seize them," she testified. "He said that successful men understood that the world belonged to those who were strong enough to take what they wanted regardless of the methods required." At the time, I thought he was speaking metaphorically about business competition, but now I understand that he was describing a philosophy that had already led him to murder. The trial of James Copeland became a sensation throughout the South, with newspapers from New Orleans to Charleston providing daily coverage of the proceedings. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including family members of identified victims and curiosity seekers drawn by the gruesome details of the case. Hotels in Augusta County were booked solid for weeks, as people traveled from hundreds of miles away to witness what many considered the trial of the century. Judge Harrison Pembroke, a veteran of some of Mississippi's most notorious criminal trials, described the Copeland case as the most disturbing he had ever encountered. A dignified man in his 60s, who had presided over everything from slave rebellions to political assassinations, Pembroke found himself genuinely shaken by the evidence presented in his courtroom. "In 40 years on the bench," he told colleagues privately, "I have never encountered such calculated evil. This man destroyed lives not from passion or desperation, but from a cold calculation that human beings were merely obstacles to his ambitions. He represents a type of criminal that our legal system was never designed to address." The defense attorney, a young lawyer named Robert Sinclair, who had been appointed by the court when no experienced counsel would accept the case, attempted to argue that his client was insane and therefore not responsible for his actions. Sinclair brought in alienists from as far away as Philadelphia to testify about James' mental condition, presenting theories about moral insanity and inherited criminal tendencies that were at the cutting edge of medical knowledge. Dr. Hamilton Breenage, a prominent alienist from the Philadelphia Hospital for Insane, testified that James displayed symptoms of what he termed constitutional moral deficiency, a condition in which the sufferer possessed normal intellectual capabilities, but lacked the emotional capacity for empathy or guilt. Greenidge argued that such individuals could not be held fully responsible for their actions because they were incapable of understanding the moral dimensions of their behavior. However, the insanity defense was undermined by the methodical nature of the crimes and the obvious planning that had gone into each murder. The prosecution effectively argued that James' detailed records and systematic approach to killing demonstrated clear awareness of right and wrong, even if he chose to ignore moral constraints in pursuit of his goals. James himself refused to cooperate with the insanity defense, insisting that he was fully aware of his actions and accepted responsibility for every death. His calm demeanor during the trial unnerved spectators and seemed to support the prosecution's contention that he was a calculating killer who deserved no mercy from the court. "I am not insane," he declared during one of the few times he spoke in his own defense. "I made conscious choices based on rational calculations about my own interests. If that makes me a monster, then so be it. But do not diminish my crimes by pretending that I was not fully aware of their consequences." The prosecution was led by District Attorney Charles Waverly, an ambitious politician who had built his career on high-profile criminal cases, and who recognized that the Copeland trial could establish his reputation as one of the South's premier legal minds. Waverly had spent months preparing for the case, consulting with experts from across the country, and developing a presentation that would methodically demonstrate the scope of James' crimes. Waverly methodically presented evidence linking James to dozens of unsolved murders throughout the region, using the finger collection and written confessions to build an ironclad case for conviction. He painted a picture of a predator who had posed as a respected member of the community while systematically murdering innocent people for profit, describing each crime in enough detail to horrify the jury while stopping short of the most graphic elements that might cause a mistrial. The prosecutor's closing argument lasted nearly 4 hours and was considered a masterpiece of legal oratory. Waverly traced James' transformation from promising young farmer to remorseless killer, arguing that the defendant had made a series of conscious choices that had led inevitably to the gallows. He dismissed the defense's claims of insanity, pointing to the detailed planning and careful execution of the crimes as evidence of a mind that was evil rather than diseased. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Waverly concluded, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "you have heard evidence of crimes so heinous that they challenge our faith in human nature itself. James Copeland sits before you not as a victim of circumstances or disease, but as a man who chose evil with full knowledge of its consequences. He murdered 47 innocent people, not from madness or desperation, but from a cold calculation that their lives were less important than his desire for wealth. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts." The foreman, a prosperous merchant named Thomas Whitfield, later described the deliberation as one of the easiest decisions he had ever made. "The evidence was overwhelming," he told reporters. "We spent most of our time discussing whether we had any choice but to recommend death, and we concluded that justice demanded nothing less than the ultimate penalty. Judge Pembroke sentenced James Copeland to death by hanging to be carried out on October 15, 1857. The condemned man received the sentence with the same calm composure he had maintained throughout the trial, nodding slightly as if the verdict confirmed something he had already accepted. When asked if he had any final words for the court, James stood slowly and addressed the packed courtroom in a clear, steady voice. "I have received the justice I deserve," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of the spectators. "I do not ask for mercy, nor do I claim innocence of the crimes for which I have been convicted. I hope that my fate will serve as a warning to any who might be tempted to follow the path I chose. There is no treasure worth the price of a man's soul." James spent his final weeks in Augusta County Jail, working with Sheriff Henderson to identify additional victims and provide closure for families who had lost loved ones to his killing spree. His cooperation led to the recovery of several more bodies and helped solve murders that had baffled investigators for years. He drew detailed maps showing the locations of burial sites and provided descriptions that allowed searchers to find remains that had been hidden for over a decade. Some observers suggested that James was seeking redemption through these final acts of honesty, but Sheriff Henderson came to believe that the condemned man simply enjoyed reliving his crimes one last time. He described each murder with the same enthusiasm that other men might show when recounting their greatest achievements. Henderson later wrote in his memoir, "I came to understand that killing had given his life meaning and purpose, and that helping us solve these cases allowed him to feel important and valuable again." The process of identifying victims and recovering bodies continued almost until the day of execution. James led investigators to burial sites throughout 3 counties, revealing a network of hidden graves that testified to the true scope of his criminal career. In some cases, he had killed entire families and buried them together in mass graves that were carefully concealed beneath fallen logs or dense thicket. One of the most disturbing discoveries came when James led searchers to a site near the Louisiana border, where he had buried 6 members of the Patterson family, including 4 children ranging in age from 3 to 14. The Pattersons had been traveling from Georgia to Texas when they encountered James on a remote stretch of the Pearl River Road. He had murdered them all for the modest sum of $47 and a gold pocket watch. "I told them I was a minister traveling to spread the gospel," James recalled with what seemed like genuine fondness for the memory. "They invited me to share their camp and their meal, trusting in my false piety right up until the moment I cut their throats. The children never even understood what was happening to them." Elizabeth Hartwell Camden never saw James again after their engagement was broken in 1845, but she sent a letter to the jail chaplain expressing forgiveness for the man she had once loved. The letter arrived 3 days before the scheduled execution and was delivered to James by Reverend Samuel Morrison, who had been providing spiritual counsel to the condemned man. The letter was brief but deeply moving, written in Elizabeth's careful script on paper that still carried the faint scent of the rose water she favored. She wrote that she had spent 12 years trying to understand how the gentle young man she had known could have become the monster described in the newspapers, and that she had finally found peace through prayer and forgiveness. "I choose to remember the James Copeland who brought me wild flowers and spoke of his dreams for our future together." She wrote, "That man existed, however briefly, and I believe that somewhere deep inside the person you became, a part of that good man remains. I pray that you will find him again before you face your final judgment." The letter was read to James on the night before his execution, and witnesses reported that he wept openly upon hearing her words. The jail chaplain later described it as the only time he had seen the condemned man display genuine emotion, though he remained uncertain whether James's tears reflected remorse for his crimes or merely grief for the life he had lost through his own choices. James dictated a response to Elizabeth's letter, a rambling confession that filled 8 pages and took nearly 2 hours to complete. In it, he apologized for the pain he had caused her and asked her to remember the young farmer she had known rather than the monster he had become. He also revealed that thoughts of her had haunted him throughout his criminal career, and that he had often imagined what their life together might have been if he had chosen a different path. "You were the angel I was never worthy to touch," he dictated to Reverend Morrison. "Every time I took a life, I moved further from the light you represented and deeper into the darkness that finally consumed me. If there is any justice in this world, you will forget that James Copeland ever existed and lived the happy life that my choices made impossible." Samuel Copeland visited his son twice during the final weeks, conversations that left the elderly farmer broken and confused. He could not reconcile the gentle boy he had raised with the calculating killer who sat chained in the death cell, and each visit seemed to age him by years. The elder Copeland's health had been failing since James's arrest, and the stress of the trial and subsequent revelations accelerated his decline. During their final meeting, Samuel begged his son to explain how everything had gone so wrong, to help him understand where he had failed as a father. James seemed genuinely moved by his father's anguish and spent over an hour trying to provide some explanation that might ease the old man's suffering. "You did nothing wrong, Father," James told him. "You raised me with love and taught me right from wrong as clearly as any man could. The choices I made were mine alone, and the responsibility for my crimes belongs to no one but myself. Do not carry the burden of my sins along with your grief." But Samuel Copeland could not find peace in his son's words. He died less than a year after the execution, and local residents believed he had been destroyed by shame and grief over his son's crimes. His farm was eventually sold to pay debts, and the new owners tore down the old farmhouse where James had been raised, claiming that no decent family could live in a place where such evil had been nurtured. On the morning of his execution, James Copeland was awakened at dawn by the sound of crowds gathering outside the jail. Nearly 3,000 people had traveled to Augusta County to witness the hanging, including many who had camped outside the town for days to ensure they could secure a good viewing position. Vendors sold food and souvenirs to the crowd, and several photographers had set up equipment to capture images of the historic event. James ate a final breakfast of eggs, bacon, and coffee, consuming the meal with apparent enjoyment. While Reverend Morrison read passages from the Bible, he had requested no special last meal, claiming that simple food suited his mood better than elaborate preparations. When asked if he had any regrets about his life, he considered the question for several minutes before responding. "I regret that I caused pain to people who loved me," he said finally. "I regret that I wasted the gifts God gave me and used them for evil instead of good. But I do not regret the choices that brought me to this place because they were made by a man who was fully aware of their consequences. To regret them now would be to deny the very essence of who I became." At 10:30 in the morning, James was escorted to the gallows by Sheriff Henderson and 2 federal marshals. He had refused the traditional black hood, preferring to face his death with open eyes, and he walked to the scaffold with steady steps that betrayed no fear or hesitation. The crowd fell silent as he climbed the 13 steps to the platform, and even the vendors stopped their calling to watch the final moments of one of the most notorious criminals in American history. James was offered the opportunity to address the crowd, a tradition that he accepted with apparent gratitude. He stepped forward to the edge of the platform and spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried across the sea of upturned faces below him. "I have confessed my crimes and accepted my punishment," he said, his hands steady despite the restraints that bound them. "Let my death serve as a warning to any who might follow the path I chose. There is no treasure worth the price of a man's soul, and no amount of gold can purchase peace. Conscience stained with innocent blood, I go to my death with the hope that my example will prevent others from making the choices that have brought me to this gallows." The executioner, a professional hangman brought in from New Orleans for the occasion, made final adjustments to the noose and asked James if he had any last words. The condemned man shook his head and closed his eyes, appearing to offer a silent prayer in the moments before the trap was sprung. The hanging was carried out at exactly 11:47 in the morning, and James Copeland died instantly when his neck snapped from the force of the fall. Dr. Henry Caldwell, the county physician, pronounced him dead after checking for a pulse and examining his eyes for signs of life. The body was allowed to hang for 15 minutes to ensure that death was complete, then cut down and placed in a plain wooden coffin that had been constructed by the jail carpenter. James Copeland's body was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, attended only by Reverend Morrison and 2 gravediggers who had been paid to maintain silence about the exact location of the burial site. Local authorities feared that the grave might become a shrine for those who admired his criminal exploits or a target for those seeking gruesome souvenirs of his crimes. The leather pouch containing 43 human fingers was destroyed by fire in a ceremony attended by representatives of law enforcement agencies throughout the South. Sheriff Henderson personally lit the pea, and the assembled officials watched in silence as the macabre trophies were reduced to ash and bone fragments. The ashes were then scattered in the Pearl River, returning the remains of the victims to the waters where many of their bodies had been disposed of by their killer. The destruction of the finger collection marked the end of the physical evidence of James Copeland's crimes, but the psychological impact of his killing spree continued to reverberate throughout the region for decades to come. Families that had lost members to his violence struggled to find closure, and many never fully recovered from the knowledge of how their loved ones had died. Sheriff Henderson retired from law enforcement 6 months after Copeland's execution, telling friends that the case had aged him beyond his years and destroyed his faith in human nature. He moved to California, with his family and took up farming, deliberately choosing a profession that required no contact with criminals or crime scenes. He never spoke publicly about the investigation again, though he did write a detailed memoir that was not published until after his death in 1893, The Detailed Confession. Notes and trial transcripts were sealed by court order and remained classified for over 50 years, preventing the full story of the Pearl River murders from becoming public knowledge until long after all the participants were dead. When the documents were finally released in 1910, they caused a sensation among criminologists and historians who recognized them as one of the most complete records of serial murder in American legal history. Dr. Hamilton Breenidge, the Philadelphia alienist who had testified about James's mental condition, used the case as the foundation for a groundbreaking study of criminal psychology that was published in 1862. His work established many of the principles that would later be incorporated into modern forensic psychiatry and criminal profiling. The Copeland case fundamentally changed law enforcement practices throughout the American South. It demonstrated the need for better communication between jurisdictions and led to the establishment of the first regional criminal identification systems. Sheriff departments began maintaining detailed records of unsolved crimes and sharing information with their counterparts in neighboring counties. Practices that helped solve numerous cases that might otherwise have remained mysteries. The methodical nature of James' record-keeping also influenced early studies of criminal behavior and contributed to the development of investigative techniques that are still used today. His detailed journals provided insights into the mind of a serial killer that had never been available to researchers before, and his systematic approach to murder helped establish patterns that investigators could look for in future cases. The Pearl River region slowly healed from the trauma of the Copeland years. The scars left by his crimes never fully disappeared. Towns that had been terrorized by his presence gradually returned to normal life, but older residents continued to tell stories about the dark period when no one felt safe traveling the river roads after sunset. Even today, more than a century and a half later, local residents speak in hushed tones about the man who collected fingers as trophies and turned a peaceful farming community into a landscape of fear. Historical markers have been erected at several sites associated with his crimes, and the cave where he stored his grisly collection has become a destination for those interested in the darker aspects of American history. The James Copeland case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of serial murder in American criminal history, a testament to both the evil that human beings are capable of committing and the determination of law enforcement officers to seek justice for the innocent victims of that evil. This mystery shows us how thin the line between civilization and savagery truly is, and how quickly a human being can surrender their humanity in pursuit of wealth and power. It also demonstrates the importance of psychological understanding in criminal investigation and the need for society to remain vigilant against those who would prey upon the innocent and defenseless. What do you think of this story? Do you believe James Copeland's confessions revealed the full extent of his crimes, or might there have been other victims whose remains were never discovered? How do you think a case like this would be handled by modern law enforcement with today's forensic techniques? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in American criminal history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you the most chilling true crime stories from America's past, tales that have been forgotten by time but deserve to be remembered as warnings about the capacity for evil that exists within the human heart. See you in the next video.